Eleanor Hayes had spent most of her career studying people who hid behind control. Politicians who rehearsed every word. Executives who measured every reaction. Men who believed emotions were weaknesses to be managed. But she had never seen a file like his. Adrian Wolfe. 32 years old. Chief executive of one of London's most powerful firms. No family. No school records. No traceable history before adulthood. It wasn't that his past had been erased. It was that it had never been recorded. Eleanor closed the file slowly, her fingers resting on the edge of her desk. Something about it didn't sit right. Not in the way incomplete cases usually did. This felt deliberate. Constructed. She told herself it was simply another unusual client. Still, as she made her way into Blackridge Group's headquarters the following morning, she carried that unease with her. The building itself reflected him, sharp glass, clean lines, everything arranged with quiet precision. Even the reception area felt curated, as though nothing existed there by accident. When she was finally led into his office, Adrian Wolfe was standing by the window, looking out over the city. He didn't turn when she entered. "You're on time," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It sounded more like an observation. "I try to be," Eleanor replied. There was a brief pause before he turned to face her. His expression was neutral, but not in the way people usually were. There was no underlying emotion to interpret, no impatience, no curiosity, no guarded politeness. Just stillness. She introduced herself, though she suspected he already knew everything about her. "I've read your work," he said. "And? It's effective." That was all. No compliment. No dismissal. Just a statement. Eleanor took a seat across from him, studying him in the same way she had studied countless others. Except this time, the usual signals weren't there. No restless movement. No micro-expressions betraying thought. It was like trying to read something that didn't want to be read. Over the next several days, she observed him closely. At first, nothing seemed unusual. He worked long hours, spoke efficiently, and made decisions with remarkable clarity. His employees respected him, though it was clear that respect was rooted in distance rather than familiarity. But the more she watched, the more subtle inconsistencies began to appear. He didn't react the way people should. When confronted with failure, he didn't show frustration. When presented with success, he didn't show satisfaction. Even moments that should have triggered some visible response passed through him without effect. And yet, he wasn't disengaged. If anything, he was too present. Too precise. During a meeting, a senior analyst presented projections for an upcoming quarter. The numbers were incomplete, still being adjusted. Adrian corrected them without hesitation. Not roughly. Not approximately. Exactly. The room accepted it without question. Eleanor didn't. Later that evening, she reviewed recordings from the office, looking for patterns. Everything aligned. His movements followed consistency. His schedule didn't drift. Even the way he shifted his posture seemed timed, as if guided by something internal rather than instinctive. But there were moments, brief, almost imperceptible, when that pattern broke. Once, he stood motionless in the corridor, his focus fixed somewhere beyond the visible space. It lasted only seconds before he resumed as if nothing had happened. Another time, his tone shifted mid-sentence. Not dramatically, but enough for Eleanor to notice. Something underneath the control wasn't stable. That was when her curiosity turned into something else. Concern, perhaps. Or suspicion. She began to look deeper. Accessing internal company records wasn't part of her assignment, but she justified it to herself. If she was going to understand him, she needed more than surface behavior. What she found was not what she expected. Hidden within secured files was a project labeled simply Eidolon. The documentation was fragmented, partially encrypted, but enough remained to form a picture. It wasn't a business initiative. It was research. behavioral engineering, cognitive conditioning, emotional suppression. The language was clinical, detached, but its meaning was unmistakable. It described the development of an individual designed to operate without the limitations of human emotion. A person who could make decisions without hesitation, without doubt, without empathy interfering. A perfect leader. Eleanor read the documents twice before she allowed herself to fully process them. Adrian Wolfe wasn't just the CEO of the company. He was the result of it. The realization settled heavily in her chest. It explained the absence of history, the precision, the control. But it didn't explain everything. Because despite what the files suggested, he wasn't entirely empty. There were moments she couldn't ignore. The way his attention lingered slightly longer during certain conversations. The subtle shifts in his posture when she challenged him. The fact that he had agreed to her presence in the first place. Those weren't the actions of something purely mechanical. They suggested something else. Something emerging. When she confronted him, she didn't mention the files immediately. Instead, she asked him a simpler question. Do you ever feel uncertain? He regarded her for a moment before answering. No. It was immediate. Unquestioned. And if something changed that, she asked. It wouldn't. There was no arrogance in his tone. Just certainty. Eleanor studied him carefully. You don't find that limiting? No. Why not? Because uncertainty leads to error. An emotion leads to unpredictability. She held his gaze. People aren't meant to be predictable. He didn't respond to that. For the first time, there was a pause that didn't feel controlled. It was brief, but it existed. That pause stayed with her long after the conversation ended. Over time, their interaction shifted. He began asking her questions. Not many. Not directly personal. But enough to suggest interest. What do you consider fear? He asked once. A response to perceived loss of control, she replied. And how do you manage it? You don't always. Sometimes you understand it instead. He considered that. As if filing it away. There was something unsettling about the exchange. Not because of what he asked, but because of how carefully he listened. As though her answers mattered more than they should. It became increasingly clear that whatever he had been designed to be was changing. The turning point came unexpectedly. They were alone in his office when it happened. Nothing unusual had been said. Nothing confrontational. Just a quiet discussion about decision-making under pressure. And then, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no outburst, no visible breakdown. But Eleanor noticed the change immediately. His composure fractured. Only slightly. His breathing altered. His hand tightened against the edge of the desk. The glass he held cracked under the pressure of his grip. He didn't seem to notice. Or perhaps he did, and chose not to react. Eleanor stood still, watching him carefully. Adrian, she said quietly, what just happened? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was lower. Interference. From what? He looked at her. And for the first time since she had met him, there was something unmistakably human in his expression. I don't know. That admission carried more weight than anything he had said before. You're experiencing something new, she said. He didn't deny it. That shouldn't be possible, he replied. And yet it is. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Not tense. Just real. Eleanor felt it then, the shift she had been sensing from the beginning. He wasn't losing control. He was gaining something else. Something he had never been meant to have. Connection. It didn't happen all at once. There was no sudden transformation, no clear moment where everything changed. It was gradual. Subtle. but undeniable. He began to hesitate in ways he hadn't before. His responses weren't always immediate. There were moments where he seemed to consider more than just the outcome of a situation. And more often than not, those moments involved her. It would have been easier to step away, to report what she had found, to distance herself from something that was clearly beyond the scope of her work. But she didn't. Because despite everything, she didn't see him as something artificial. She saw him as someone unfinished. And that made leaving feel wrong. One evening, as the city outside faded into quiet light, he spoke without prompting. This wasn't part of the design. She knew what he meant. No, she said. It wasn't. Then why is it happening? Eleanor considered the question carefully. Because you're not just what they made you to be. He looked at her, searching for something in her words. And what am I, then? She didn't answer immediately. Because the truth was, she didn't fully know. But she understood one thing clearly. You're becoming something they didn't plan for. He didn't respond to that. But he didn't dismiss it either. And in that quiet uncertainty, something new took shape. Not control. Not perfection. Something far more unpredictable. Something human. And for the first time in his life, Adrian Wolfe didn't seem entirely certain of what would come next. And neither was she. But neither of them chose to walk away.